So thanks very much. I hope you're enjoying the workshop so far. I find it very interesting, and I'm going to lead off the second set of presentations. And I think what you'll hear from this group of presenters is some strategic examples of how companies are looking to deploy risk-based strategies into our global quality procedures to manage manufacturer-supplier interactions. Very good. So what I'll do is give you a high-level overview of what the Perrigo company has done to deploy risk-based strategies in its global supplier quality management program. But I'd like to start out with a quote from Margaret Hamburg, which was made about a year ago. And she commented that since 2006, there's been about a 500% increase in the amount of drug shortages. And if you look at the root cause of those drug shortages, you can align 2/3 of those to quality issues. So really, whether we're looking at drug shortages or other quality events within the pharmaceutical industry, the assurance of robust quality systems can ensure our ability to deliver safe and quality medicines to our customers and patients. Of course, to build compliant global quality systems, we need to not only look at the regulations that are in place today, but we also need to be forward-looking. So what are the new regulations in place, some of the new legislation, and what does that mean as we move toward the future as far as how we engage as a company and how we engage with our supply base? So emerging themes in the last few years, we've heard a lot this morning about supply chain security. Also about the paramount issue of patient safety. There's also additional regulations and increase in enforcement of the manufacturers and drug suppliers as well. And regulators are now talking about what are the value-added quality metrics that need to be put in place so that the regulators can track and trend what are the quality metrics that can ensure that companies are indeed meeting their obligations. Recent legislation such as FDA's Safety and Innovation Act, we just heard about the Falsified Medicines Directives. There's an EU Good Distribution Practices Directive, as well as other companies are coming up with their ideas on what the definitions of GDPs are and the track and trace serialization. These are all relatively new regulations in place that are going to impact the global pharmaceutical environment, and how we stay ahead of the pace is going to be key. So, taking that into account, what Perrigo did a few years ago was to try to determine where are we as a company with regard to our pace and our systems for supplier quality management. And one of the things we found through that research was that we certainly had opportunities for improvement. We had a lot of manufacturing facilities at a lot of satellite locations, but we didn't have a lot of integration and a lot of cross-communication. So there was clearly a need for us to build global program. So a few years back, the position I currently hold was created with the responsibility to build this global platform to allow our varied manufacturing operations to be able to communicate both internally, so the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, but also so that we could provide a unified face with our supply base so that they're getting consistent messaging from Perrigo. So one of the things we determined is that we really needed to improve really three main areas. And the first thing was to increase or improve our efficiency. And that was by introducing a level of standardization in some of our key supplier quality management processes that allowed us to better leverage the limited resources we had across the globe. The other thing that we wanted to improve was our effectiveness by streamlining our processes. So Perrigo is very heavily invested in Lean Sigma principles. We wanted to leverage those principles to provide common platforms across our global network, but we still want to provide the flexibility down at the manufacturing site level. So I'll try to give you some examples later in the talk on how we balance that standardization versus flexibility at the site level. And then the third thing we needed to do is certainly maintain our compliance, but I would argue improve our compliance by utilizing simplified processes built on consensus from all the impacted sites so that we can provide consistency operationally. And it's the consistency that is of the utmost importance. And through that consistency, one, we'll be able to share information in the same language internally amongst our various operating sites. But again, we'll also be able to communicate outwardly to our supply base on what the Perrigo standards will need to be. But we also need to think about quality risk management processes as well. So I took this from the ICH guidance on quality risk management, and it defines risk as the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So in other words, what we mean is, what's the frequency of this quality event, and what's the potential impact of that event? So as you can understand, something that occurs relatively frequency that has a high impact to patient safety or to your business is going to be classified as high risk. Alternatively, something with a low frequency with a low impact of occurrence is going to be garnered a low risk. It doesn't mean that the risk is gone. It just means that the risk has been identified as low. But what this does is it allows you to stratify risk. So putting in tools that allow you to assess that risk allows you to prioritize where you need to allay your resources. And certainly from looking at an overall quality risk management process, you certainly need systems in place to identify what is that risk. You then need to deploy tools to evaluate or assess that risk, and then you need to have processes in place that allow you to manage that risk. So one of the models that we use that is common throughout the industry is the 4T model of risk management, where you can either, one, tolerate the risk, so the risk is acceptable to you. You can treat that risk, so if it's too high of a risk, you can try to implement systems to mitigate that risk. You can also transfer the risk. So I don't mean transferring the responsibility, because as drug product manufacturers, we are responsible for the products that we manufacture and distribute. But it can be easy for you to transfer the management of the risk, say, to a third-party logistics supplier. You may want to transfer that responsibility for management of the risk to a warehouse, for example, because they may have daily interactions with that particular service provider, and you may not have a relationship built with that supplier. And of course, if the risk is too high, you can choose to terminate that risk and look for alternatives. So one of the things I'd like to show is the approach that Perrigo has taken to build its global supplier quality management program. And we use a life cycle approach. And this is very consistent with what a lot of people use in the life science industry, but you can also see it in the automotive industry and in other commodity industries as well. And it starts with the identification of a need. So in the pharmaceutical industry, there's usually a product that's needed. And to us, that means a list of raw materials and components that are needed to produce that ultimate product. The requirements needed for those materials then allow the company to identify a slew of potential suppliers that we put in the queue. And then there's a risk evaluation and a data gathering process that allows us to wean those potential suppliers into suppliers that are actually selected for use in our production. What Perrigo has done is then we've actually added a qualification and approval. Sometimes this particular aspect of SQM is embedded in the selection process. We've divorced that from the process because there's additional things that Perrigo will do, whether it be implementation of a quality agreement, an audit, a variety of other things that we might do that helps qualify and provide an additional status to those suppliers. Then after we build some history with those suppliers, we go through a supplier risk tiering process. And I'll show you an example of the risk matrix that we use that actually classifies our suppliers based on the level of risk they bring into the organization. That's key in our life cycle because it's the tiering of our suppliers that dictates the level of supplier maintenance that we have. So we have programmatic aspects on the things that we require of our high-risk suppliers. This also allows us, again, when we stratify the risk, we can assign our resources to those highest risk suppliers. Of course, if we have a situation where risk is increased or at an unpalatable state, we can go through a dequalification or a deselection process of that particular supplier. And usually what that indicates is removing that supplier from your supply base, but there's now an opportunity for a replacement supplier to come into the supply chain. So I don't have an opportunity to go into all of these in detail. What I will do is I'll go into, at a very high level, 3 of these particular elements. And the first is going to be on supplier identification and selection and the risk analysis that we use in that process. I'll then be talking about the risk tool that we use for our supplier tiering, and then we'll talk a little bit about supplier maintenance as well. So this is an depiction of the risk assessment that we use for our supplier identification and selection process. So as Perrigo, when we think about that process of identifying potential suppliers and approving a supplier, there are certain functions that really aren't amenable to risk analysis. So from an R&D perspective, the material either works in the formulation or it doesn't. From an analytical perspective, it meets the specification or it doesn't. So there's a lot more black and white in that situation. But from a quality perspective, there's a lot of varied things that we can look at across our business sectors that allow us to evaluate whether a particular supplier is going to be a high risk or a low risk according to how we utilize that supplier in our operations. Because of the diversity of our supply chain and our business sectors, so Perrigo is involved in manufacturing in India and the UK, in Latin America, Israel, across the US. We're also involved in a variety of different business sectors. So we're traditionally in consumer healthcare, in the over-the-counter medicines, but we're also involved in prescription pharmaceuticals, animal health, API manufacture, medical devices, nutritionals, infant formula. So we have a very large diversity of business sectors. So our ability to come up with a single risk assessment across all of our business sectors was really going to be unpractical. So the decision that we made was to, 1, mandate that a risk assessment needed to be done during this process. 2, to mandate the 4 categories that were required from all sites in their risk assessment, but we delegated the specificity of what questions needed to be asked down to the site level. So we're empowering the sites based on their local regulatory environment and based on the business sector that they support. We're allowing them to define what are the important key elements of risk for their site. In all, each site will then evaluate and score their suppliers based on this. And what this provides is really what we found, at least at Perrigo, is some tangible data that quality can bring to the table with the other disciplines that are involved through the supplier selection process. And that is to say, we have a quantifiable data that evaluates the risk of this particular supplier. Before this happened, there was a lot of maybe anecdotal evidence and maybe not a lot of credence given to the quality organization. But when you come with a formalized document that everyone agrees that these are the risk areas that need to be evaluated, and where you actually have the documentation in hand, the wider organization seems to accept that. So we found this to be a critical tool in the supplier identification and selection process. Moving on to the tiering process, at the current time, because we've only implemented this process in the last year, the only suppliers that we have within this system are our raw material suppliers and our packaging component suppliers. There are multiple elements that are used in our tiering process, and I'll show you an example of the tiering matrix that we use. But there's 2 elements that we really use that have some type of risk evaluation involved in those, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. The other thing that's important here is that this is a standardized form. So this form that I'll show is used across the organization. So every site will use this form, and that helps Perrigo because we have our Australian facility, and if they tier a supplier and they tier them at a certain tier, every other site in the organization understands what that means. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, need to think about this tiering matrix with evolution in mind and integration in mind. So as we continue, the acquisition processes Perrigo has been involved with over the recent years, we may be bringing on new types of business sectors, so we wanted to make sure that the platform for supplier tiering was amenable across all of the life sciences. And of course, as I mentioned earlier as well, the tiering process is very intertwined with our supplier management program. So this is an example of that risk assessment from a tiering perspective. It's a streamlined version just to show you the overall aspects. As I mentioned, there is a supplier quality history and a business impact. These are the evaluative components of our tiering model. The first two, the material category and our manufacturing site information and regulatory oversight, these are things that you really can't change. But when we evaluated the tiering process, we did need a way that we needed to differentiate an API supplier's risk from a secondary packaging component supplier's risk. We also needed to identify a way where we could identify risk for suppliers in countries of what we would consider high regulatory oversight and those that had maybe improving regulatory oversight needed. So, for example, if you are an API supplier from China or India, based on this model, you are high risk across those elements. That's just the way that it is. However, from a supplier quality history and a business impact, there's a variety of different elements that can be used, such as deviation history, quality agreements in place, responsiveness to CAPA, a variety of different elements within that quality history to allow us to evaluate, is this a good supplier that we have a good relationship with, or is this a troublesome supplier? From a business impact, it could be just cost of the materials, number of materials that we receive, materials involved in key products, or the number of high revenue or high profit products. Could be single sourced materials here as well. So a lot of different things involved in those evaluative methods, but again, this is a scorecard. So ultimately, when you fill this out, you come out with a number, and we have a prescribed range for what numbers mean what level of supplier. Now, the one thing that we do within this context is, because we know this is overgeneralizing and we understand that, so we're allowing sites, if they bring a supplier through this tiering process and they end up with a supplier tier that they think is inconsistent with the knowledge that they have with that supplier, they're allowed to change that tier, but they have to document it on the form. So there's documentation involved in this. What we found is that it's very rare that we're having people from the sites change the tier. We're also seeing, amongst the hundreds of shared suppliers across our sites, we're seeing very little difference with regard to the tier level. So we think, at least at a first pass, we have a pretty good framework in mind, but we certainly understand that there's increased rigor that needs to be involved in this as well. And of course, then moving into the supplier maintenance phase, as we had mentioned before, our high-risk suppliers, who are our tier 1 suppliers, we're going to mandate certain things in place. So we're going to mandate an annual audit, on-site audit for those suppliers. We're going to mandate that a quality agreement needs to be put in place. Supplier scorecards need to be put in place for those tier 1 suppliers. For our lower risk suppliers, we're not necessarily going to require those in place, but we're going to either suggest alternate methods of oversight or maybe delay the frequency of certain things. The one thing also that's important to remember when you're developing a supplier oversight or a supplier maintenance program is that from a global perspective, at least within our business model, we could really only ascribe a minimum standard. But because we're involved in such a diversity of business sectors in different regulatory environments, we have every site that has additional site-level SOPs that include maintenance activities. So although what I showed you were the minimum activities, each site is going to have to be required to do that extra level of maintenance activity on their supply base. And the whole idea here is kind of the move down or move out philosophy. So if you're a high-risk Tier 1 supplier, we're trying to mitigate that risk to move you to a Tier 2 status. If you're a Tier 2, we want to continually improve and try to move you to that Tier 3 status. So then very quickly, what are our next steps? So again, this is a very new process for Perrigo. It seems to be working fairly well. One of the things we have identified is we're actually getting cross-functional talk amongst our sites, so that's a very good sign, but we do need to increase the rigor of some of our elements. We need to pursue additional standardization and continuous improvement of some of our elements. We also want to include things like supply chain mapping, maybe standardized supplier questionnaires to help increase the standardization and the increased communication across our sites. We also are considering maybe moving to a 4-tier model to, again, give a little bit more discrimination amongst the risk basis across our supply base. We also want to increase the visibility of our supplier network. We're actually seeing some positive things internally. And we also plan to expand the scope of this particular program to include not just our logistics providers around the GDP space, but also our external manufacturing suppliers as well. And of the utmost importance is, from an internal perspective, Perrigo is trying to get, in other words, our ducks in a row, so that when we engage with our supply base, we're speaking with a unified voice, and we can engage and really foster that supplier relationship. Something that Perrigo, I think, has done a reasonable job, but we certainly see areas for improvement, is engaging in a relationship with our suppliers, being a little bit more transparent about our needs, and we think that through this global quality program, we feel that we're on the right road. So at that point, I'll